Hi, my name is Android Mail, and today, I will be talking about Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. The 14 points was a statement of principles for peace that was used for peace negotiations in order to end World War I. The principles were outlined in a January 8, 1918 speech on the war aims and peace terms to the United States Congress by President Woodrow Wilson. However, his main allied colleagues, George Clemenceau of France, David Lloyd George of the United Kingdom, and Vittorio Emanuele Orlando of Italy, were skeptical of the applicability of Wilsonian idealism. The United States had joined the Triple Entente in fighting the Central Powers on April 6, 1917. Its entry in the war had in part been due to Germany's resumption of submarine warfare against merchant ships trading with France and Britain, and also the interception of the Zimmermann telegram. However, Woodrow Wilson wanted to avoid the United States' involvement in the long-standing European tensions between the great powers. If America was going to fight, he wanted to separate that participation in the war from nationalistic disputes or ambitions. The need for moral aims was made more important when, after the fall of the Russian government, the Bolsheviks disclosed secret treaties made by the Allies. Wilson's speech also responded to Vladimir Lenin's decree on peace of November 1917, immediately after the October Revolution in 1917. The speech made by Wilson took many domestic progressive ideas and translated them into foreign policy, free trade, open agreements, democracy and self-determination. 3 days earlier, United Kingdom Prime Minister Lloyd George had made a speech setting out the UK's war aims, which bore some similarity to Wilson's speech, but which proposed reparations to be paid by the Central Powers, and which was more vague in its promises to the non-Turkish subjects of the Ottoman Empire. The 14 points in the speech was based on the research of the Inquiry, a team of about 150 advisors led by foreign policy advisor Edward M. House, into the topics likely to arise in the anticipated peace conference. Now, I am going to read about the post-war world. The immediate cause of the United States' entry into World War I in April 1917 was the German announcement of renewed unrestricted submarine warfare and the subsequent sinking of ships with Americans on board. But President Wilson's war aims went beyond the defense of maritime interests. In his war message to Congress, Wilson declared that the United States' objective was to vindicate the principles of peace and justice in the life of the world. In several speeches earlier in the year, Wilson sketched out his vision of an end to the war that would bring a just and secure peace, not merely a new balance of power. Congress had declared war on Germany on the 9th of April 1917, and until the 14 points, Wilson's statements about American war aims had been rather vague, mostly limited to statements about being for democracy and against aggression. When Pope Benedict XV in the 1917 speech called for the immediate end of the war on the basis of the restoration of pre-1914 status quo, Wilson in a letter to the Pontiff on the 27th of August 1917 rejected the Pope's call for peace as he wrote, "Our response must be based on stern facts and upon nothing else." America wanted not a mere cessation of arms, but a stable and enduring peace. Wilson argued that he was rejecting the Pope's peace message on moral grounds, as he argued that a lasting peace would require saving the free peoples of the world from the menace and the actual power of a vast military establishment controlled by an irresponsible government that wanted to dominate the world. Notably, Wilson was vague about what he considered to be a stable and enduring peace, other than it required the defeat of Germany. Wilson in his speeches and letters was always careful to make a distinction between Germany's criminal government and the German people. At least part of the distinction was due to his knowledge of the political crisis in Germany. In 1914, the majority of the Social Democrats, SPD, the largest party in the Reichstag, supported the war, believing the government's statements that Russia was about to attack Germany. The SPD joined the other Reichstag parties in the Bergfrieden peace within the castle under siege, in which the parties agreed not to criticize the government in its handling of the war. The SPD made it clear, however, that their support was for a defensive war only and that they opposed a war of conquest. From the beginning, the left wing of the Social Democrats opposed the war on the grounds that the German working class had no quarrel with the working classes of France, Britain and Russia. In 1917, the party split over the issue of the war, with the anti-war faction forming the Independent Social Democratic Party. By then, the majority Social Democrats were also becoming increasingly disenchanted, as discussions about the war often centered on annexations, making it apparent that the allegedly defensive war was in fact a war of conquest. The majority Social Democrats voted with the Catholic Center Party and various left liberal parties in July 1917 for the Reichstag Peace Resolution, which called for a negotiated peace without annexations. Their resolution was only symbolic with no binding power over the government, but it was an important step towards the Reichstag developing a voice for peace and for parliamentarization. President Wilson subsequently initiated a secret series of studies named the Inquiry, primarily focused on Europe, and carried out by a group in New York, which included geographers, historians and political scientists. The group was directed by Edward M. House. Their job was to study Allied and American policy in virtually every region of the globe, and analyze economic, social, and political facts likely to come up in discussions during the peace conference. The group produced and collected nearly 2,000 separate reports and documents, plus at least 1,200 maps. Walter Lippmann of the Inquiry defined the main American war aim as the disestablishment of a Prussian Middle Europe and to find a way to prevent Germany from being the master of the continent after the war. The Armenian genocide that began in April 1915 attracted much media attention in the Allied nations at the time, and throughout the summer and fall of 1917 Wilson had been the subject of fierce criticism by Republican politicians such as the former President Theodore Roosevelt and Senator Henry Cabot Lodge for his unwillingness to ask Congress to declare war on the Ottoman Empire. In a foreshadowing of the Germany First strategy of World War II, Wilson and other senior figures in his administration argued that the United States should commit its power to defeat the German Empire first, and that any operations against the Sublime Porte would be a waste of American resources. Wilson argued that Germany was an advanced, industrial nation, while the Ottoman Empire was a backward nation with almost no modern industries, and as such the defeat of Germany would automatically lead to the defeat of the Ottoman Empire. Both Roosevelt and Cabot Lodge argued in various speeches and columns that the United States had a moral duty to stop the Armenian genocide by declaring war on the Ottoman Empire. Roosevelt in his popular newspaper column in the Kansas City Star that was nationally syndicated accused Wilson of crying crocodile tears over the Armenian genocide, as he maintained that if he was still president the United States would have already ended the genocide. In response to such criticism, Wilson had asked Colonel House and the authors of the Inquiry, such as Lippmann, to come up with a plan to protect the Armenians after the hoped for Allied victory, even though the United States was not at war with the Ottoman Empire. The parts of the 14 points relating to the Near East, where the emphasis was upon protecting minority rights, were at least in part designed to rebut the criticism that the Wilson administration was indifferent to the genocide being waged in Anatolia. The purpose of the Armenian genocide, together with the related genocides against the Pontic Greeks and the Assyrians, was to achieve the homogenization of Asia Minor. Colonel House advised Wilson that the genocidal homogenization of Anatolia required an American response, writing to the president, "It is necessary to free the subject races of the Turkish Empire from oppression and misrule. This implies at very least autonomy for Armenia." House wrote in his diary, after the Turkish paragraph had been written, the president thought it might be more specific in that Armenia, Mesopotamia, and other parts be mentioned by name. I disagreed with this, believing that what was said was sufficient to indicate this, and it finally stood as framed. Though the genocidal policies of the Committee of Union and Progress regime were not referenced by name in the 14 points, the emphasis on protecting the rights of minorities under the Sublime Porte, together with what was described with some understatement as the undoubted security of life, was an implicit response to such policies. The studies culminated in a speech by Wilson to Congress on January 8, 1918, wherein he articulated America's long-term war objectives. The speech was the clearest expression of intention made by any of the belligerent nations, and it projected Wilson's progressive domestic policies into the international arena. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks led by Vladimir Lenin overthrew the Russian provisional government in Petrograd. The next day, Lenin issued the Decree on Peace, which called for the immediate end to the war on the basis of a just and democratic peace, which he defined as a peace without annexations or indemnities, national self-determination in place of the traditional power politics, and the end of secret diplomacy. Lenin repudiated the foreign policy of Imperial Russia, and published the secret treaties that the former regime had signed with the Allies, under which the Allies had envisioned extensive territorial changes and divided much of the world up into spheres of influence. Lenin surrendered all Russian extraterritorial rights and concessions in China with the notable exception of the Russian-owned Chinese Eastern Railroad. This won the new Bolshevik regime much prestige in China, to the discomfort of the other powers that held extraterritorial rights there. The publication of the secret treaties relating to Europe, Africa, China and the Near East caused the governments of Great Britain, France, Italy, and Japan much embarrassment at the time, as the secret treaties made it appear that the Allied leaders were only self-interested. The publication was especially embarrassing for the Allies, as the former government of Russia had signed no secret treaties with Germany, the Austrian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, and thus the war aims of the Central Powers remained secret. Lenin accused the Allied leaders of being selfish while presenting himself as an idealist who sought the betterment of ordinary people by rejecting imperialism. At the time, it was felt that Lenin had seized the moral high ground, as he was able to present himself as someone with no apparent interest in championing his nation at the expense of other nations. Despite his claims of idealism, Lenin was in fact self-interested in the degree on peace. The Bolsheviks had come to power on the basis of an immediate peace with Germany, and Lenin knew very well that the Germans planned to annex vast tracts of the former Russian Empire by creating a number of puppet states. Hence his statements about the right to national self-determination were made to prepare the way for the expected territorial losses when a peace treaty was signed with Germany. However, this was not widely appreciated at the time, and Lenin was able to present himself as an idealist. Wilson, in common with other world leaders, were afraid of the possibility of communist revolutions inspired by the Russian example breaking out elsewhere, and decided to offer his set of idealistic war aims as a way to challenge Lenin's claims to the moral high ground. The American historian Eric Goldstein wrote that Wilson created the 14 points largely to provide an ideological alternative to Lenin and his communist regime. When drafting the 14 points alongside his close advisor and friend, Colonel House, Wilson mostly spoke about Russia. The American historian N. M. Phelps wrote that in January 1918 Wilson needed to seize the moment if he was going to avoid being eclipsed by Lenin's competing program for the post-war world. On the 5th of January 1918, the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George gave a speech in London stating that the British war aims were self-determination for the subject peoples of the Austrian and Ottoman empires. Next is the speech. The speech, known as the 14 points, was developed from a set of diplomatic points by Wilson and territorial points drafted by the Inquiry's General Secretary, Walter Lippmann, and his colleagues, Isaiah Bowman, Sidney Mezes, and David Hunter Miller. Lippmann's draft territorial points were a direct response to the secret treaties of the European Allies, which Lippmann had been shown by Secretary of War Newton D. Baker. Lippmann's task, according to Howes, was to take the secret treaties, analyze the parts which were tolerable, and separate them from those which were regarded as intolerable, and then develop a position which conceded as much to the Allies as it could, but took away the poison. It was all keyed upon the secret treaties. In the speech, Wilson directly addressed what he perceived as the causes for the World War by calling for the abolition of secret treaties, a reduction in armaments, and adjustment in colonial claims in the interests of both native peoples and colonists, and freedom of the seas. Wilson also made proposals that would ensure world peace in the future. For example, he proposed the removal of economic barriers between nations, the promise of self-determination for national minorities, and a world organization that would guarantee the political independence and territorial integrity of great and small states alike, a League of Nations. Though Wilson's idealism pervaded the 14 points, he also had more practical objectives in mind. He hoped to keep Russia in the war by convincing the Bolsheviks that they would receive a better peace from the Allies, to bolster Allied morale, and to undermine German war support. The address was well received in the United States and Allied nations, and even by Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin, as a landmark of enlightenment and international relations. Wilson subsequently used the 14 points as the basis for negotiating the Treaty of Versailles, which ended the wars. Phew. That was a lot of reading. That is it for part 1, I will see you next time on part 2. Bye bye!